from really East Street, which is today University Street. I always wonder why they called it University and not, all I had to do is take East Street, take off the T and make it Y in the end. They could have had University of Redlands could have been on Easy Street. Yeah. And that would be an Easy Street off-ramp too, you know. How could they use that? But anyway, the park itself was a dump. It was the Laguna dump. But it had the Zanja flowing through it, and there was concern about typhoid and other kinds of diseases because people were taking all their garbage and throwing it there. So those nice little rolling hills are all trash heaps, okay, converted over. And then, let's go to the next one. You can see once again Sylvan Park here. The lines show it much more squiggly, but actually the Zanja flowed fairly straight. The tea people took it and put it in their front yards and made twists in their front yards so they could hear the water as it splashed up against the sides. It's both your drinking water, your domestic water, and unfortunately your sewer. People used it for all those purposes. And so downtown Redlands on State Street was built with the idea of all the horses that would need drinking water were right parallel with Sankey. Next. So Cook, who owned property here, he's the developer of the land they called Laguna Heights. We are in Laguna Heights, except we're in the low end. The upper end is up towards Stillman Avenue. Cook had a house up next to the university, or where University Hill is today. And today the plan the university would like to see eventually is they'd like to have the light rail station, maybe on Grove and the Sylvan. They purchased property there, perhaps for that purpose in mind in the future, for light rail. Let's go to the next one. So as we get out towards the eastern of the valley, following Sylvan Boulevard, is one of the oldest streets in Redlands. It was dedicated in 1888, and it was the only boulevard. We have streets and avenues in Redlands, but we gave the distinction of Sylvan Boulevard because it was to be maintained as a small street with no large wagons. It was simply for transportation between Redlands and Crafton. And they wanted to have it as a beautiful street because it already had the trees growing along the Zanja. So it was a nice shady way to take a trip to Crafton and then from there go into the mountains. Next. A lot of this stretch here really from, what is this, Wabash all the way down to Dearborn and beyond. County Flood Control has put in a deep ditch. That is, they've taken the historic Zanja and they made it into a flood control ditch. Gertrude Hagum, who first started the Say the Zanja group in the 1970s, wanted to avoid this situation, where this would just be a chain-linked area. And of course, the University of Redlands would, I'm sure, hate to see a chain-link fence behind the Greek Theater with a deep ditch and a flood control sign saying, "Keep out." We're trying to avoid that. And in fact, we like to take the areas where the county has done this, particularly in this area here, and convert it back to the more natural ditch it should be. Next. Sylvan Park, when you get past Wabash, Wabash is the boundary of Redlands. So once you get to the east of Wabash, you're looking at county territory. Orange Groves and the Zanja taking more of its loopy directional. Crafton School was started in this location in 1888, the corner of Wabash and Zanja, because once again 1888 drinking water for the horses and also for the kids. Maria Armienta Bermudez, the first resident of Redlands in 1832, dug her own private ditch from what is now Crafton School over to Ford Park, just below Ford Park, Braswell's, and irrigated that area and had a vegetable garden. And then once a week took in her vegetables into Los Angeles and sold them. So beginnings of agriculture and a ditch off the ditch being built. And then Juan Alvarado built another ditch where Stater Brothers is on Barton Road in the 1840s, so another ditch, and then the Tenney ditch on top of that. So 3 or 4 different ditches all coming off of Mill Creek, Zanja, because it was the main artery for irrigation. This area here, once again, is pretty much prime and with the exception of one stretch near Opal Avenue, which has also been made into flood control ditch. On the corner of Opal and the Zanja, in 1854, the Crams had their furniture factory. And then it went from a furniture factory, after 2 years, the early 1860s, we have Wyatt Earp's family moved in there, Nicholas Earp, and then Wyatt lived there along with Virgil and others. Wyatt didn't like the boring life of growing corn along the Zanja, so he worked for the Frink family in Old San Bernardino and ran a stagecoach from Old San Bernardino out to Ehrenberg, the Colorado River area where gold was discovered, and liked that frontier excitement a little bit more. And then in 1877 or 1875, the same house that was built by the Crams was used by the daughter of Mrs. Crafts as an Indian school, the oldest Indian school, 1875 in the entire area. Okay. Further down the street at Opal Avenue, another family moved there in 1871. They were from Riverside. The Craig family, they developed a brand for their wine, which they grew in the area, and they called it Lagonia, from the Lugo land grant. And the name caught on, and when they named the new school district in 1877 Lagonia, and then later on the street became known as Lagonia, we have the Lagonia name, which is the tie-in with the history, as I said, with the Spanish land grant. Next. So from Opal, heading east, once again, now we're in all Crafton Orange Grove territory. Right here in this location, the Cave family settled in 1860. They sued Myron Crafts, who lived out here beyond King Street, sued over water rights. The case went all the way to the state Supreme Court. That's a big deal when a state goes to the state Supreme Court over water rights. Cave versus Crafts then is the basis of why we know so much early history, because everybody had to go in and testify. And they actually had portions of the trial along the banks of the Zanja. They actually took the trial in San Bernardino, moved everybody out near Barton Road and where Stater Brothers is today, and conducted the trial along the banks of the Zanja for 2 weeks. So everybody who was on the jury could get an idea of the geography of what we're talking about. Okay?
Was that K-A-Y? The name of the family?
No, C-A-V-E. It's the same property that you own.
C-A-V-E.
C-A-V-E. John P. Cave. In fact, there was no cemetery, so they were buried right on the property for a while. And then in 1886, when they put in the cemetery in Redlands, the bodies were removed and then taken up to the Hillside Cemetery. So all along from Opal all the way up to King Street, there's a lot of historical sites. One of the main ones, of course, on the end of Walden Avenue is the 1876 Payne Ranch. But before it was the Payne Ranch, there was a mountain man who lived there in the 1860s who actually ran burros up to Big Bear once a week. It was the freight line, the major freight line to the Holcomb Valley Gold Rush of 1860, 1861. And he raised alfalfa right where the Payne Ranch is. And then he sold, actually he leased the property for a while, and then he his lease was then carried over to two gentlemen from Lagonia who didn't have the money to buy a property. They leased the property. They grew corn, they grew alfalfa, they made some money, and then went back to Lagonia and bought that expensive property for $10 an acre. Okay, and then the Paynes from Riverside arrived in 1876, and the Paynes, there's been a Payne on that ranch, I think in Walnut, since 1876. And they're on the third house on that same piece of property. So there's a long carryover in terms of history for that area. The people that lived in Crafton built all kinds of reservoirs. These reservoirs make interesting walking sites. They could be little pocket parks developed all the way up into the green spot area. And they were there to store water because they owned 6 hours of the Zanja every day. And so the 6 hours from 3 p.m. till 9 p.m. every evening they took out, and then at 9:01 the water had to be sent back down the Zanja so it would make it up by sunup to the people who lived in West Redlands. And so every hour of this ditch was accounted for, every minute of this ditch was accounted for in terms of the water flow. And so